and I think this is really important, or end users come into play to say, what's really going on in this project? You can go from top to bottom, just like you click through an article on Wikipedia, link by link by link, and say, well, what's this calculation mean? What's this piece of data mean? How do I prove integrity? And if you really don't want to trust it, you don't have to. And I think that that's the opportunities. You can trust through verifying information, but you can also see how that relates to other projects over the long haul. And I think that's the opportunity for Hedera with Verra together. And that allows applications to build off of each other. So it doesn't just have to be through the front end of filling out a form, but it could be a series of applications piping in data across that network.
That's great. I love that. That was a really eloquent summary. So thanks, Wes. It obviously means that there's more, like you said, it's an immutable record, right? But there's transparency. And am I correct in assuming that there's a level, and this might be a transition to talk about the digitization of PDDs, but is there more of a standardization around the data entry? You know, Joe mentioned before, and you mentioned also, that you need a PhD effectively to be able to discern the content and the context of PDDs, because they're, you know, could be 100 pages, could be 300 pages of data, including calculations and all of the methodological data flows that need to then be assessed at the standard. No wonder it's so complicated for essentially Verra as the certification body to review each project. Welcome back to This Week in Carbon. Again, I'm moderating the podcast. Eddie Smith will not be joining us. He's actually in Sao Paulo at the AIDA Latin American Climate Summit. But today I'm joined by two very exciting guests, Joe Dell'Orfano from Verra and Wes Geisenberger from the HBAR Foundation. Joe and Wes, welcome to This Week in Carbon. It's a pleasure to have you guys.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks, Rene, for the invitation.
Oh, thank you. And so, you know, today, really, I want to focus on the way that Verra and Hedera, and I'll mention that constantly, and I keep kind of thinking about the rhyming aspect of it, but essentially how you guys are laying down the digital rails. And as I view it, effectively rewiring the carbon market. So I'm really excited about this conversation. Now, some context for our audience. Verra last week essentially dropped what I termed in last week's episode a bombshell. And essentially, you've announced that you're building a next generation registry infrastructure in partnership with S&P Global Commodity Insights, essentially leaving behind long-term registry partner APX. But here's the twist, and I really want to unpack this with you, which essentially is that blockchain is at the core of this transformation, and Hedera is helping to provide that kind of technology and stepping into the spotlight. And so I really wanted to explore in this episode how the Verra and Hedera partnership is set to effectively help to overhaul the way that carbon markets operate. And my hope is, and I'm hoping that you guys can reinforce this, that effectively this digitization and this evolution, this paradigm shift, will enable faster project onboarding, digitizing methodologies, and even the interoperability around compliance markets, and ultimately providing a digital trust layer that will enable the longevity and the scale of carbon markets over that long term. So that's kind of my intro. So maybe, Joe, maybe we can start. Can you tell us a little bit about this transition with the S&P registry and partnership, what was announced last week? I think that would be good for context setting, and then maybe we can dive into some more specifics.
Yeah, no, that sounds great. I'm not sure I'd use bombshell as the analogy.
Maybe for me it was, because I'm
yeah.
obviously ex-expansive guy, and you know, was there when we acquired the APX registry, and it was a long-standing relationship.
Sure, and it is, yeah. Certainly it's big news and a big change for Verra. But you know, you alluded to Hedera and S&P, and certainly the work that we're doing internally. I categorize it more as getting the right pieces of the puzzle in place. And the registry, obviously, as you know, is a key component of that. So it's been very much a journey. I joined Verra about 1.5 years ago. And when I first came on board, it was clear that the organization had been looking at registry partners for quite some time. and we really need to organize as a team. And so we put together kind of a group of cross-divisional players to start assessing the market more broadly. And there were a number of different options for us to explore, right? One is, hey, do we build this ourselves? I like to say that I've got a lean and mighty team, but to tackle
that's the best kind.
building the registry, I think is maybe getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, or kind of the ski analogy is getting ahead of the skis a bit. So then there was an opportunity to, do we kind of co-build with a partner? Hedera could have been one of those options for us, and then you've got the more traditional buy routes. And so we really explored all of those options. The co-build is certainly interesting, but it would really be getting driving innovation maybe beyond where we need to really focus right now. I think our Project Hub, and we'll talk more about that later, is really where we want to drive differentiation for Verra versus the registry capabilities. And so we focus more on kind of your traditional partners. And what I'll say is, it's somewhat of a level playing field, right? Everybody now has migrated to modern cloud-based architecture. And so each of the players out there, including Expansive and ICE and others as well, have that foundation in place. So then it was more a matter of, diving deeper, right? So who could offer us, reference checks, who had, a cadre, if you will, of existing clients that we could talk to and explore. And then there's aspects of partnership, right? Who did we think we could really work with effectively and drive innovation in the market? So a piece of the puzzle is the fact that we had made the Hedera announcement in advance. And so, even revealing that with our prospective partner, which turned out to be S&P, they were open to that partnership. And we're like, hey, if this helps to further digitization and modernize your technology platform, give it a go, right? So they didn't put up barriers around that, which was revealing, just as one small example.
Mm-hmm.
So ultimately, based on, a lot of that analysis and research, we did choose S&P as our partner. They've been around a while. So they were founded actually in 1860. And, it's interesting if you go look at kind of their history and their story. They were founded on integrity, discovery, and partnership. They say that's embedded into their identity. They work constantly to expand data and insight capabilities. And those are all the things that we're focused on, right? That the carbon market's focused on, that the partnership with Hedera is focused on, is really about integrity, discovery, auditability, insights into data, so that there's a level of transparency and openness that hasn't previously existed with PDF documents. It's hard, as you know, right, to pull data out of that. And so this really gives us a chance to think differently.
Because it's not standardized.
Yeah. With a partner that frankly has a ton of expertise and data and insights that we can leverage and glean from as we move forward. So that's a bit of the background and how we got to the decision. There's a couple of key components with S&P. One is the core registry, which they call their RAS offering, so registry as a service. And then the second aspect is what they're calling their meta registry. And I know in your conversation with Mandy, our focus is about interoperability and really growing the broader pie. And so the vision around that meta registry is, right, interoperability across the market. And hopefully that will increase insights and connectivity across the different players. And so, as I mentioned earlier, we spoke to all the key industry players, and we have every intention of continuing to work with them. And hopefully through meta registry and other mechanisms, we'll continue to be able to partner across the industry ecosystem, if you will.
Great. No, Joe, that was fantastic. Thanks for the context setting. I really appreciate that. And so Wes, can I get you and include you in on this conversation? And essentially, Joe mentioned it and alluded to it in his intro. Verra and Hedera made an announcement that predated the S&P one. I think it was back in May of this year, if I'm not mistaken. Can you walk us through the work that Verra is doing with Hedera? Mandy intimated some of that in our previous conversation, but I'd love to do a deeper dive with you if that's possible.
Absolutely. And thanks again for having me. I'm really excited to be here. And as part of that announcement, what we're really talking about is Vera leveraging a network for communication. And the way that we communicate with standards, and it's part of streamlining the workflow, if we allude back to Mandy's episode and your conversation there, is helping Vera maintain a standard, digitize methodologies in a way that's more efficient to be able to do that faster, higher at a higher rate of speed, but be able to enable that streamlined, consistent experience across different stages of a carbon project, whether it's from registration or all the way through monitoring up to issuance, and helping streamline each possible step of the standard from a calculation to a form to where that workflow needs to go, whether it's a VVB or earlier in those stages. And the opportunity is with our tools on Hedera is to use that network for allow project developers or VBBs to communicate in the context of that methodology or that workflow. And the opportunity is we get to know who said what when for each point of data, improving the integrity, but that's actually emanating from accounts on a public network. And so if you think about it from a model of networks you're used to dealing with, maybe it's Visa or MasterCard, you go to a terminal, you swipe your card, and somebody knows you have funds or an allowance to spend money. Well, Hedera, you can certainly have things like that related to tokenization, but you can also notarize data and say, at this time, I said this in the context of this methodology. You can run a process or a calculation in the same way. And you can think about it as that immutable audit trail, but in the context of those rules in this very complicated process. And maybe there's one or two approaches that lead to a series of calculations and a series of decision trees. But most project developers have to navigate that today on hundreds of pages of PDF documents with years of expertise and a PhD. And what we have the opportunity to do is to make that a seamless set of forms that you'd walk through just like any other application, any other piece of software. And a real opportunity is not to just do that for project developers, but to do that for communities that they work with, stakeholders within the market, and then when a buyer comes into play. And I think this is really important, or end users come into play to say, what's really going on in this project? You can go from top to bottom, just like you click through an article on Wikipedia, link by link by link, and say, well, what's this calculation mean? What's this piece of data mean? How do I prove integrity? And if you really don't want to trust it, you don't have to. And I think that that's the opportunities. You can trust through verifying information, but you can also see how that relates to other projects over the long haul. And I think that's the opportunity for Hedera with Verra together. And that allows applications to build off of each other. So it doesn't just have to be through the front end of filling out a form, but it could be a series of applications piping in data across that network.
That's great. I love that. That was a really eloquent summary. So thanks, Wes. It obviously means that there's more, like you said, it's an immutable record, right? But there's transparency. And am I correct in assuming that there's a level, and this might be a transition to talk about the digitization of PDDs, but is there more of a standardization around the data entry? Joe mentioned before, and you mentioned also, that you need a PhD effectively to be able to discern the content and the context of PDDs, because there could be 100 pages, could be 300 pages of data, including calculations and all of the methodological data flows that need to then be assessed at the standard. No wonder it's so complicated for essentially Verra as the certification body to review each project. So does the digitization actually help to provide an easier data entry piece? First question. Second question, does it provide for a better platform for auditability as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's from a data entry perspective, you think, well, if I go to fill out forms, you may want to fill it out on Verra's Project Hub. You may want an application that talks to Verra's Project Hub. Now, today, there's a lot of integration costs for every piece of software to go through an API. But if you just go across the Hedera network, you're removing all those emails that we used to do with PDFs, all those Word documents that the data formatting may not be correct, the information not be, may think it's right, but it may, you may have a better way to prove it's right or not right ahead of time. And that actually goes back to an example. I think Mandy was talking about the Uber. Is it going to be there on time? When is it going to be here? In the last episode. And this is the opportunity to say, well, is it right? And maybe why is it not right? Or why would it be right? Or how could it be right? Where's an example. And so if you say, well, it's not just about filling out data, but what if we can start to pipe in information from different sources, satellite data, sensors, other elements? It could be a cook stove sensor, it could be a direct air capture facility, but maybe it's atmospheric monitoring tied to a sensor in a forest for an eddy covariance flux calculation, where we've done grants in other aspects of our portfolio. These are all opportunities that we can now tackle in a better way to get to automated data entry. So we're not reading sensors, making sure they're calibrated right. That can all be automatic. So the minutia that we do on this data collection that is oftentimes, it could be perceived as busy work if we can just pipe that right in and prove where it came from. So we don't have the integrity questions and we can see further and further behind what's today in a PDF. And that's part of the reason I'm really excited. And I think the opportunity on that is to see the data in layers as well, right? So you have data that fills out in a form. The form is, in technology, we call a set of schemas. There could be hundreds of these, hundreds of these schemas together. But in carbon, we want to think about it from a buyer perspective a lot of times in terms of quality. Those forms, those data points, they add up into statistics or maybe labels like what you would see coming out of the ICBCM and the core carbon principles. You may see labels for like what you would have a buyer country care about from a 6.2, Article 6.2 perspective in an ITMO. And all of these things need to be distilled in such a way that it can be consistent across the market. And I think that gets to a point of interoperability where you say, well, if a credit's coming out of Verra, I can still know exactly where it came from. It followed a specific process. And so from a data entry point, it's not just easier to input, it's easier to output into different formats that are applicable to many different market stakeholders. And so hopefully I answered the questions, but happy to.
Yeah. No, but it actually raises more sort of curiosity. It's essentially, we're shifting effectively from static PDFs to effectively machine readable logic, essentially, is my understanding here. And essentially that alleviates the silos, the manual verification and processing, and this kind of open to interpretation, and makes it more of like a rules-based system that essentially, you called it schemas. That's the first time I've heard that kind of methodology or nomenclature, I should say. But it's interesting because it's like machine executable logic. Effectively, you could have the test for it, and essentially, like you said, it opens up. And I'm not a tech guy, but like what you were saying before kind of made me think, oh, great. Yeah, you've got satellite information, drone, LiDAR, potentially Internet of Things. You could have a bunch of different inputs of data that could then be rationalized and then put onto the network, effectively onto the blockchain. So you have these immutable records. That's a richness of data that it hasn't been able to be defined previously, or if it is, it's some human's interpretation of like, I want to put this in, and it's, David Antonelli is a friend of mine, obviously Verra's former CEO. He calls it the creative writing exercise, and I think it's great, but like this is a necessary evolution. So maybe it's a pivot, and so Joe, I'd like to bring you in on this. Like, what is the Verra project hub today, and what are you hoping that it becomes over the next few months and years ahead, leveraging the partnerships that you discussed, S&P Global and the Hedera network?
Yeah, it's a great question and something we're really excited about. And just to maybe go back to the previous conversation, I think,
let's.
An advantage. So we were ahead of the Hedera announcement in terms of digitizing what we call our digital project submission tool. Mandy mentioned the other day that we've digitized 21 of the methodologies. And so an advantage was we were working directly with project proponents. They were entering the data, and we developed what's called the calculation engine. And so which helps to determine emission reduction and removals. And so they were seeing discrepancies between their data and what the calculation engine was coming up with. And so on the fly, really, we're able to do that validation, make updates, versus in the past, you would have submitted that information via PDF, and it could be weeks, maybe even months before you knew the outcome. And then you'd have to go back and really update and validate your information, right? So I think that in and of itself is like a leap forward and helps to reduce and cut the time and process.
Yeah, but it also removes the burden on the individual human having to kind of unscramble the omelet effectively every single time and do this interpretive reading of all the data. Now you can have systems in theory that can actually do, like you said, the calculations, which is rule-based approach. And now it's universally applied to all the project proponents. So gaming of the system, which has been a fear of some folks, can be mitigated, right?
Exactly. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
So talking a little bit about the Project Hub. So if you haven't seen it before, we should get you a demo.
Yeah, let's do it. I'd love to do that.
We recently
we sit on the buy and sell side, so we never really kind of go up the stream. I mean, my business partner Nick DeLeva, you know, he was instrumental in building up APX, so he would love that. I know he'd love to join that call.
Yeah,
because he knows out on this
so
stuff
you
all the
can
time.
go out to projecthub.verra.org, and so it brings you right to our dashboard, which we recently introduced. So you can think of the Project Hub as a combination of tools, templates, and then methodology management. And so we've been working hard over the past couple of years. Mandy mentioned that we started with our project tracker. So that gives you real-time visibility into where your project is at any point in the process. And, you know, with S&P, with the work that we're doing with Hedera, I think we can get even more granular with regards to really showing a stakeholder where you're at in the project review. We'll talk about in a minute what we're doing to help automate the review process as well. But I think that's what, you know, stakeholders really want to know: where am I at? And what are the barriers and impediments for me getting to where I'm here today to getting issuance? And so I think we're getting to the point where we're going to be able to provide those real-time insights. So from Project Tracker, then we've developed a number of tools, like even the public consultation, for instance. That is now enabled via Project Hub. So again, that gives us access to data that we previously didn't have access to. And so, you know, future orientation, we can leverage things like AI to start to get sentiment analysis from the type of feedback that we're getting from the public. Also helps the teams internally assess, hey, what are some areas that, you know, stakeholders are really excited about versus what are other areas that we need to drill into to ensure that when we launch a new methodology or get feedback related to a project, we can really understand the nuances of the feedback that we're getting.
So can I double click on that for a second though, Joe? So because when you talk about the public comment piece, I mean, there's folks that listen to this podcast that are more, you know, let's say on the market side, right? So they're traders, intermediaries, whatever it might be. But then there's folks who are buyers, and then there's folks that are project developers. So maybe not all of them understand kind of some of the nuances there. In the public comment, like period, who are the typical respondents in that process? And what are their kind of grievances and or concerns? And what are they trying to improve in terms of the state of the art? I think that would be helpful for folks to understand.
I mean, you know, the audience is broad, right? It could be project stakeholders, it can be government, communities, you know, other NGOs, you know, even folks on the buying side, right, that are trying to better assess and understand the benefits of a said project. So stakeholders are broad, cross industry, cross you know, public, private sector, etc. And so, you know, we take that information seriously. You know, frankly, just to give you an example, we just completed public consultation for BCS version 5. And so we received over 2,000 comments. And so the team is going through a process of really vetting those comments, assessing what changes, if any, that will bring upon BCS 5 as we look to launch that later this year. Does that help?
Yeah, that helps a lot. Okay, so now essentially the Verra Project Hub provides essentially the entry point and also the transparency that's necessary for the market to have that visibility, right? Like obviously there's the stakeholders that have the vested interest, the project developers, and ultimately the buyers, etc. You're playing the role of the certification body, but then there are external parties, whether they be, let's say, rating agencies, data aggregators, NGOs, think tanks, whoever it might be, that want to audit the data. And so whereas now kind of, let's pivot kind of, so what is the, you know, the benefits of Hedera's blockchain infrastructure within this context? You know, you walked us through that, but like how does transparency how's transparency realized in this in the real world, right? You said
Yeah,
you
maybe
had an
just
example
to
of the
yeah,
wiki.
complete thought on the project
Yeah.
hub. So I mentioned, we got project tracker, we've got tools and templates.
Mhm.
Like kind of the crux move, if you will, is digitizing these methodologies. So as I mentioned, we digitized 21. Now with the Hedera partnership, that gives us an opportunity to accelerate and further the digitization with an additional 20. And improving out the Hedera platform then is migrating that underlying infrastructure to their blockchain technology. So that's kind of the end goal. And then in digitizing those methodologies, that enables DMRV, so digital monitoring, reporting, and verification. So that's kind of the front end of the process. And then on the back end, we're automating what we call our digital project review process, including the project review report, which the VBB and the project proponents review. And then we're enabling, we call it long-term monitoring system. So especially for nature-based projects, we're using geospatial data, looking at biomass, and with that, we're able to detect loss events. So obviously these projects have a very long tail to them. And so this helps to give us insights on, hey, that area that was supposed to remain forested, are there events where cutting is happening or fire, which then is impacting the viability of what was reported. And we can bring that information back to project developers, project proponents, so they can be more proactive versus reactive. And obviously, as I know you and Mandy talked about insurance last time. Potentially, this is data that could become available to insurance parties as part of that overall risk assessment. So really, we're thinking about the Project Hub from an end-to-end perspective, the full workflow from project initiation all the way to issuance, which ultimately occurs into the registry. And then what are those long-term, what are our long-term abilities to continue to monitor and validate that, those emission reductions are actually happening. And if not, being able to take corrective actions and provide that public disclosure around it. So that's kind of the broader vision. And then let's talk about the Hedera partnership.
Yeah.
So, we're a couple of analogies there. We're taking kind of a crawl, walk, run approach. We started with Alcott VM33, which is a blue carbon project. So we actually got to make that announcement in Senegal. And we use the mangrove analogy. So if you think about a mangrove, right, it helps, flood prevention. It also is a filter in terms of helping to create a clean ecosystem for, fisheries, etc. And so we really view Hedera is kind of like that mangrove, right? So it's filtering out all of the bad network effects, having that auditability, having that transparency so that there can no longer be a question about where was the source of this information? Where did it come from? And the goal there is to hopefully increase market integrity, confidence, which from a longer term perspective should drive higher value from a carbon credit perspective.
Yeah, that's an area that I really want to double down on. But let's, Wes, I want to really bring you in on this. And can you speak to just what Joe was commenting on, the Hedera kind of role here, and specifically, like I'm just trying to figure out, like, where does this data reside, and then how does it ultimately benefit all of these different stakeholders that we've talked about, right?
Yep. So no, that's a good question. And so there's a few different layers. So I'm going to answer the where does the data reside first.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to talk about maybe some of how folks can engage. And what are some of the benefits of how folks can not just engage, but build what they're doing into this network effect that we're looking to achieve. And so the data is still at Verra, right? It's, the data that's private is still remaining private with the stakeholders who can access it. And we have some tools to enable that to happen. I know that sometimes you say, well, oh, it's on a public network. What we're actually doing is notarizing that data. We're taking a credential that's just an attestation that says, hey, here's my monitoring report. Here's my PDD, just like you would normally send it to Verra. However, there's certain data that is already pre-known to contain PII that's still stored locally. Could be stored in your local systems if you have an application. Maybe an auditor or Verra can see it if it's relevant. Maybe it's not necessary. You may not know the names of every household in a clean cooking project. That may not be necessary. The name of every farmer
Mhm.
in an agriculture project. It's certainly not necessary for the buyers, but it may be necessary for an auditor to know certain information. At the same time, we want to make sure we're checking all those boxes and all those fields along the way, and we know who said what when did they say it, and in what context, and that's important. But the data is logged across Hedera. If it's a, say, sensor, it's streamed across Hedera coming out of that sensor. That's more of a future state for a lot of these methodologies that only have certain capabilities or allowances, but they evolve over time. And one of the big opportunities is the methodologies can now more easily evolve over time because we can literally put them side by side in that same comparable, comparable rule set. The data can be machine readable, and say we have a calculation that needs to change. It's a lot easier for Verra to say, well, these 15 projects out of 80 maybe are affected, and we can migrate and upgrade that. You may want to say, well, how does this tie to a rating agency, like you were mentioning before? We have these capabilities now on top of those layers of the methodologies and the templates to build statistics. This is a really cool opportunity because those statistics can point back to all single data points that maybe lead to durability or permanence, or maybe proving a specific sustainable development goal. And we can build those out to say it meets a CCP here or CCP there, or maybe a quality label on conservation. All these different elements can now be brought together. It could even be that A plus score or B plus score to make it more transparent. Why is it an A plus with one and a D minus with another from a ratings agency perspective? And we really encourage all the ratings agencies to engage in that because these methodology templates are going to be public for the project developers to take, but also for the ratings agencies to say, well, here's why this score is this way. And it can be
Mhm.
objective. For the first time, it can be understandable, score to statistic to a very specific set of data that proves quality. And the opportunity is so that we get to a better, clearer market, a more transparent market. And
Yeah.
when you say, well, what can I do if I'm, maybe I'm a software project and I say, I have an application that collects project developer information I work with, maybe it's Clean Cooking or maybe Red Plus. What you actually can do is you can go take our open source code base off of GitHub. You can work with your
Really?
project developer, just how you're taking data in and bring that into your software. But instead of building an API to, another application or even to Project Hub, you can just log in with your registry account and pipe that data across, and that's where we're going. And that means no PDFs and emails and API maintenance, which is just a fancy way to say integration between applications. And
Yeah.
that's the big
Totally know that. Yeah.
opportunity. And so those costs go away. Our transparency can go from a rating or a label all the way down to the data. And that means when you get to a buyer, you know from what application, from which project developer, with which rating, and how is it related. Because sometimes it's really hard for project developers to know even which rating agency that they should choose. And maybe they want to see both, or maybe a specific buyer wants one or another, and they don't know why or how they're going to get a certain score to get to a specific buyer and a specific price. And this gives a lot more clarity for both sides of the market in that way. And there's a
Yeah.
lot of other
Uh,
what we call composable features, but those network effects are really important.
Yeah, no, this is fascinating. And look, I've spoken with a number of obviously the rating agencies since they've emerged. Tommy and Seb at B0, we spoke about this at length, and same with Al at Silvera, and even had Donna and Duncan on the podcast recently from Calyx Global. Essentially, I think this, like, I can completely agree with your analysis. Like, this benefits the rating agencies. Historically, we had this binary outcome, right? It was approved at Verra or not approved at Verra. So it was a VCU or not a VCU. And then the rating agencies came through and they provide a risk lens that they view the projects through, and then they provide an opinion, essentially. Here's our rating, right? They had to do this really large exercise. So I'd say the three main rating agencies, they had to ingest the data flow, right? Like the data that was not codified, or they had to separate that out. So they did their own digitization efforts and effectively created a parallel system. Now they can leverage the original source, right? And so you could have the API connection, but you could have analytics. And so essentially this helps to benchmark projects much more effectively down to the granular detail, right? And then you can overlay that real-time data and information, Joel, as you were mentioning, right, with the GIS satellite information around nature-based, for example, to view the performance of the project. So you can have continuous monitoring. That level of transparency, I think that's the core heart of where people focus on integrity, because it's a bit of a thrown around word, right? But like this really underlines that integrity of the quality of the data. And then you can make a determined analysis and view on the quality of the credit that comes through.
So one thing I do want to say though is you don't even need the APIs, and that's the cool thing. So if every rating agency says, I want to look at that VM33 project, and I have my rating published, my methodology of it, of a rating, or that formula, you can actually draw it directly from the data, publish how do I define durability in the one standard versus another. And actually, we helped write a standard, and it's from a group called the Interwork Alliance, and we've been working on it for about 5 years, called the Voluntary Ecological Markets Task Force. It is a mouthful, but they wrote a very granular standard to translate the layers of the methodology into commonly understandable terms. This was before a lot of these other groups, CDOP and others, have emerged, and that allows it to translate upward into statistics. So it even works across protocols or standards or methodologies. And the opportunity, though, is those rating agencies can come in and publish this. If you're academia, you can publish what's called a tag, which is almost like open commentary. If you have questions about a calculations, questions about a formula, concerns, it's that all can happen as a discourse on a public ledger. They can, over time integrate with some of these larger systems where it can be that network effect that happens on a public forum in a public ledger. But the source is that it starts with that methodology. We can't get behind the PDF. We can't compare the methodologies until they're starting there. We can compare the data until they're in the box of the methodology. And then that opens up the entire world really of opportunity, from automation to analytics off the operational, view, to how does this integrate with markets? And how does this benefit markets so we get to a transparent set of statistics and attributes and labels that we say, just like we look on the side of a cereal box and it has a, specific organic label or fair
what it
trade
says on
label.
the tin. Yeah.
What is really inside this? And I would say that this is going to be much more transparent than what's on the side of that tin. So
no, completely, because you've got all the data points and that, like you said, digital notarization. Can I pivot just slightly? And Joe, so I'm going to ask this question here because something, Wes, that you said really kind of intrigued me, which is essentially having the digitization of the methodologies was this, this long process, and you just kind of intimated something to that effect. But the analogy that I think about, and obviously it's a layman's analogy, so correct me if I'm wrong here, but effectively digitizing these methodologies and having this data being effectively, let's say standardized for the lack of a better word that I can't think of right now. But effectively, it's like software. It is software, right? And so you could apply an improvement to that software. And just as my Mac does a software upgrade every time that Apple releases a new version, you could essentially update the version of the methodology and then publish that into the real world. Is that a fair kind of assumption? Am I correct, or am I dreaming?
Yes, no, you're not dreaming. That's the
Okay, cool.
goal.
So it's not like an AI hallucination. I'm okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, version updates, right, should be much easier to manage in the future because you've got the underlying data, and then it's just a matter of applying, the fields that are, or the new data elements, and being able to potentially take what's already there and update it for the new requirements. Or as Wes alluded to, as one methodology evolves to another, you've at least got the starting place and can, through automated systems, transfer that information. And so you're much more efficient and effective. And hopefully it makes the lives of a project proponent much easier.
Yeah.
I think the other element, data really is the foundation or the building block. Everybody wants to jump right to, well, what are you doing with AI? You've got to have the data first, right?
Yeah, of course. It's yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, it's like a CRM,
so
rubbish data in, rubbish data out. Like you got to start with the integrity of the data set. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But then you've built up this huge data lake that then can be effectively mined for these insights, right? Like as you were talking about. So that to me is really fascinating. Can we kind of address the elephant in the room? And I think we've kind of danced around it, but like this sort of evolution or paradigm shift that you guys are basically ushering really help to, I think, provide greater level of confidence to the buy side. And so buyers right now, if I make it reductive, right, and I just say corporate buyers, right, because they, with the exception of Microsoft, they tend to lack a level of sophistication, right, in terms of depth of teams, et cetera. If I look at large commodity trading houses, they've got large origination teams and they've got like a lot of experts to compare a shell, to. But so most corporates end up taking a lot of time to do due diligence on projects. This to me would make it, I think, a lot more palatable and maybe streamlined for those buyers to come up that knowledge curve and be able to evaluate projects, not only leveraging the ratings, because the ratings are providing that leverage to a large degree today. And that's the kind of de facto view, right? I want to buy, and here's my rating cutoff. I want this methodology, go, right? And then an intermediary is providing that solution, or there's a bilateral agreement with the project developer. But in this case, you could ingest all of the available supply that's on screen, whether exchange or otherwise, pass it through your own filter, evaluate the projects in a much more compressed time period, and then ultimately make decision. Again, am I hallucinating, or is this a real sort of outcome that's wished for and hoped for?
No,
that's definitely a real outcome. I'll let Wes go first, and then I'll chime in as well.
Yeah, please.
Well, I would say that's not just correct, but you're thinking about what you see from a Verra Project Hub perspective. But if you look at economics from a market perspective, you can also see the total supply. The total supply is not what is currently there on the spot market today. If you look at some of the reports from last year, it's about $14 billion of project investment, and the year before that, a little bit less, but still above 14 billion. And you say, well, the total supply is what's not just here, but what is projected to come as well, just like any other commodity. And what you would say is the total supply is going to continuously go up or down based on the issuances. And so if you think about a market, you think about all the data behind each project that makes up a series of assets, and you would say, well, what's coming as well? And you can make better decisions on what's going to be available better when you understand the data and the projected supply, because all these applications can also use the public network well to get started on their PDDs a little earlier. You're not just getting the PDFs after the fact. You can better project what's coming, where you want to be, how you want to buy over time, and the level of quality of what you want to buy based on the information that's now available to you. That wasn't possible.
That wasn't possible before. Can I jump in on this one, Joe, before just nerding out on that point? Because to me, it's a foundational point that you're making here, Liz. Around before we had this very nebulous view around what is the total addressable market, right? And we could do an analysis and just basically subtract what was issued, what was retired, what's the net, and then look at that, right? And we'd have some level of analysis and granularity. And, you know, the State of the Voluntary Market report does a good job, and they do this kind of census of the market, but essentially it's a survey, right? And I always complained that it wasn't sophisticated enough, and that we needed to look under the hood to look at what is the spot volume, what is transacted as well on exchange. That was visible because the exchanges published that data. You know, when I was at CBL, we published that. That was a critical component. But we found it very, very difficult to look at the, I kind of use this iceberg analogy, right? We could see what was above the water, but below the water, it was hard to quantify, right? And things like, what is the churn in the market as well? Like, not just the first fundamental pieces, Wes, that you're talking about, but, you know, what is the total forward issuance? What is the current spot supply? What is the rate of retirement? And you can have an analysis around what is the direction of travel. Is there a short sort of squeeze available, you know, looking, you know, in the market? But specifically, you could determine as well how often these credits are traded, because I think it's really naive to just think that the credits are issued at the project developer and then purchased by a corporate. There is an entire ecosystem of liquidity providers that then you provide liquidity where necessary, right? It could be Sumitomo buying on a forward curve. Then they sit on it, then they'll trade it out, and then it might trade it 10 times or 5 times or 2 times. How often does this trade? And if we knew that, then we could apply analysis around pricing, the volume, and the churn, and then get a total market analysis around what is the market cap. And I think that that's been lacking and would be so beneficial for our market, because as soon as the market cap is more than this tiny sum that's been kind of bounded around, you know, that it was like $2.5 billion market in 2021, which I think is a gross underestimation. And now you're talking about tens of billions of dollars entering this market on a forward basis. We can now actually start talking about a market measured in tens of billions of dollars. That attracts a different cadre of participants to the market, right? Large hedge funds, institutional investors, and others who can provide the necessary capital and allocate that through their own risk tolerance into this market to help to get further and further supply and go up that marginal development cost curve. So for me, like that is always been the dream. And the way I'd summarize it is, it seems to me that you guys are focusing, from what I'm understanding, on the integrity layer, right? This is a data layer around integrity. That then begets greater confidence. Confidence begets greater liquidity. Liquidity is like a flywheel, and it just starts to then spin, and we can see acceleration back in the market. So that's kind of my assessment. Joe, I kind of hand you the ball on this one. Do you want to kind of take on what I've said, but also
Yeah, no, and
what
I
you were
think,
about to say earlier?
yeah, I mean, to your point, you know, and this goes to the S&P partnership, right? You know, the goal there is that market interoperability, and which implies data accessibility, right? And different ways to consume that data, draw conclusions, make analysis, with the ultimate goal of helping to grow this market. And if we go back to the origination of this conversation, without digitization, the market can't grow and scale, right? And I think that's really what, you know, the partnership between Verra and Hedera provides, is establishing that right foundational architecture, obviously increase transparency around the data, but ultimately the goal is that the market grows and scales, which is the reason we're all here, right? And ultimately solving broader climate challenges. So technology underpins it all. Data is the accelerator, gives you information from which to make the right decisions, really across all stakeholders in the market: buyers, proponents, BBBs, governments, and other entities.
Okay. I mean, yeah, what a great conclusion, but I'm not going to let you guys off the hook. I want to dive into some other stuff because I love that, Joe. So I want to put in an exclamation mark as an emphasis, but I want to dive in on one of the words that you said, which was interoperability, right? And so we've got various different carbon markets. People talk about the carbon market, but there are compliance systems, you know, EU ETS, China ETS, you've got so traditional kind of, you know, allowance markets, and then you've got systems where there's fungibility of carbon credits, Colombia, Singapore, Chile, etc. And then you've got Article 6 markets under Paris, under the PACM, and you've got 6.2 bilaterals, and then you've got essentially industries like CORSIA for aviation, and then you've got voluntary markets, all with their own different flavor and different methodologies. It seems that what you guys have just outlined here is this paradigm shift in terms of evolution and sophistication of the infrastructure that underpins the market. And this is light years ahead of where the rest of, certainly the Article 6 system is. But let's talk interoperability. So how does now this very ecosystem integrate or interoperate with other standards let's say in the voluntary carbon markets, the gold standard, CAR, ECR, Carbono, you know, isometric, Puro, et cetera, and with these other systems for CORSIA? It seems like the CAD Trust, the Climate Action Data Trust, was trying to create this data layer of interoperability. Is this an evolution beyond that, or does it integrate well into it? Like, how do the registries speak to one another, basically, is the question.
Yeah, I mean, that is the holy grail, isn't it?
Yeah.
So,
well, because it allays the concerns around double issuance, right?
Yeah.
And then, so that's one, I think, interest rate, that's been mitigated, and I don't think isn't much of a risk. So project developer, you know, can't really apply at gold standard and Verra, like that. They're going to talk and they can figure that out. That's pretty quick, and so is the public domain. So that's a very low risk. But where the risk does exist, and this interoperability, and what that does to mitigate the risk is basically the double counting risk at certainly under Paris Agreement with corresponding adjustments. So it seems like this is a really strong foundation to enable that.
Yeah.
So that's the first part, and then I've got a couple questions after that.
Yeah, so I think we'll see how the market evolves, right? But even with our migration over to S&P, our intention is that expansive CBL and S&P are integrated as part of our go live, right?
And full transparency, S&P is a shareholder in Expansive, so there's a bit of, you know, friendly, like brotherly love here.
Yep. But so that's a building block, right? Of many that need to occur, and I think we'll see over time, you know, the market appetite, right, to really create that interoperability across different standards, across the registry partners. But I think the intention is there. And then to your point around Article 6, you know, I'm the tech guy, right? So remember that. But, you know, I really like to think of it as, you know, Verra in a box, right? So Verra, we've got digitized processes. We're partnered with Hedera, which provides that, you know, visibility, transparency, auditability, with S&P as our registry provider. And we can be a provider for government, right? We've got the skills, the acumen, the science and rigor, and the technology, right? Why reinvent the wheel when you've got this strong foundation from which to leverage?
Yeah. Wes, can I get your insights on that?
Yeah, and I think interoperability is important, right? Because if you can't, you mentioned double counting and double issuance, but what about in the process, right? There's projects that cross different sectoral scopes or different fancy way for saying it, different types of projects, forest projects, clean cooking, these different biofuels or biomass, and that happens actually in the workflow. That doesn't happen on the issuance, and those overlaps could be offsets in the voluntary carbon credit area. They could be insets. They could be tied to other claims that are happening. And those types of things, we have to know the data. And that's, I think, a really important element that we're spending some time and effort on in the Hedera ecosystem. And when it comes to 6.2, I think it's really important that we have a fast lane to get to stood up on process and methodologies for consistency, comparability. Because if you want to add something as a country, especially the host country, or you want to add a requirement as a buyer country, you have to have a way to communicate that so that all the project developers have a fair playing field. And the opportunity is, well, if you can go grab the template from working with Verra and work with kind of the Verra in a box process, and then maybe it's issued out of that host country registry, right, as an ITMO. And we could prove with that statistic that we talked about before, or that label that's meeting a buyer requirement, we've just answered, some of the key questions that are there on double counting, double issuance questions, different types of claims for different markets. We've helped put structure on a process that takes time to stand up in a government setting to communicate to project developers that allows them to start today under a Verra standard that's well known and well tested. But it gives a way for that statistic and label to work for, a buyer country to really say, what's the fast way to audit this process really has been followed? How do I understand it? And I will say one thing that I think is so important, we didn't quite touch on yet, and it's maybe a topic for another day, but we talked about data integrity, but there's financial integrity on the projects. And the financial integrity of these projects is one of the biggest opportunities in the public ledger space.
So let's
We've
go into
done
it. Give me an example.
so if you have a project, right, it's the auditability doesn't happen from financing the spot carbon credit sales. Oftentimes that happens at the investor level in forward contracts, right? How much money in the return of this project is going to come back to a financier versus someone who's buying for offtake? And could I trace the funds in digital dollars or digital euros or another currency to a specific account? And is that going to pay for operations of the project? Is it going to go to pay for different types of impacts, health, could be schools and education? Can I prove it? And so when we did it, we were oftentimes thought of as a granting organization at the Hedera Foundation. And we've given out grants specifically to focus on this area so that we can take, well, can I issue a digital forward? Does that digital forward help someone get from a project idea note to that PDD to help them in the maturity curve ahead of what would come to Project Hub? Using the same tools, right? This open source Hedera Guardian, building out templates that can then automatically communicate with Project Hub and Verra, but that same account or the series of accounts for the folks who work from a project developer communities or specific providers, could be data providers like satellite imagery. If you can follow the dollars in those currencies to who owns forwards, who owns rights in the project, all of a sudden you can start to follow the funds and you can say, well, X amount of funds have come from forwards. Y amount of money has come from a spot carbon credit sale over time, right? Is part of an offtake agreement. And you can start to correlate the total proceeds to a project. And that's what we're working on right now with the Alcott team as part of their projects, whether it's in Senegal or other locations. And to be able to trace that and say, okay, well, X% as part of a claim has gone to the community. And I'm not just saying it, I can prove it. Here's the in-kind contribution to a community wallet. Here's the dollarized contribution that has gone to different community initiatives. And that's something we think that it actually can help raise not just the credit integrity from a data perspective, but from a financial perspective to avoid different risks of that project, you know, going, you know, going wayward in the future years, because we can actually prove it with data, but with finance that's actually happening because it's happening on the public ledger. And that's not per se tied into Verra, but we have applications like Evercity that we've also given a grant to who help enable these forward issuances so we can do that traceability step by step, even upstream in the market where we'd like to go. And where we're planning on going is taking that into things like green bonds. Well, if I have 5 projects, 10 projects together, we build out a cash flow model. We can actually prove the finance from a vehicle to every single project. Show a bank we're using the funds appropriately, show investors we're using
But
the
you
funds
still need to make an
appropriately.
analysis around what is the price of that credit, right? In terms of
Oh,
for the discount
absolutely.
forward cash flows, right? So you'd have a base case, etc.
Yeah.
But it makes a lot of sense, Wes. I mean, this is, you guys are kind of coming in and you kind of like answering a bunch of my dreams and aspirations for this market. But like digital forwards, I've been dreaming about forever, right? I just see that, you know, and we spend, for full transparency, we spend a lot of time now at Volaterra advising clients on the sell side, helping them to overcome the two rate limiting steps for their potential to scale. And so those are the offtake piece, right? And shifting away from having the upfront payment purely on for off-takers, because the corporate buyers and the off-takers really, they can be the financiers, but they shouldn't be providing upfront financing for the project unnecessarily. And so typically the delivery versus payment model makes sense. And now the quality of that offtake can now then be leveraged and now by the financiers who say, great, we want to provide that risk capital here. And essentially they look at the project on a risk basis. And they could either come in debt, sub-debt, you know, mezzanine, or in equity. And now you actually start to leverage really large portions of capital, make this market at scale, as opposed to kind of the piecemeal thing. A digital forward enables, like you said, it's the guaranteeing of the claim, right? It's making sure that when I've provided that financing, I've got that stream of credits, if it's a streaming agreement, or if it's a pure offtake, that those credits, once issued, they belong to me. Like that's a senior secured claim. Now I've securitized that asset. And so that to me is really wonderful. I understand so that's great. I give that a 10 out of 10 if we could see that. Where I'm a little bit hesitant is the kind of investigative kind of deconstruction of where the money flows, because transparency is wonderful, but there's a level of opacity that's really necessary for markets to thrive, especially like if I can reverse engineer and know exactly what my counterparty is holding, right? Like then there's basically, it's antagonistic to liquidity, right? And so you know, if you're a hedge fund, if you're a bank, if you're an intermediary, if you're a principal in this market, you want to be, you don't want to telegraph your positions, right? Because if you're short, they're just going to pile on. And so you need to have kind of some level of like privacy, like you said, but I think that is realizable, right? So that's fascinating. But I'd like to invite you back to talk about that in the future. And I'm conscious of time, but maybe kind of as we round out, a thought's occurred to me, right? So, and I love the fact that we've had this conversation around touching on interoperability and the integrity piece and the transparency and all these sorts of really incredibly transformative aspects. And the interoperability around these national registries, I thought was really, really interesting. And we talked about, you know, Verra as a box, right? So Verra as a service kind of thing for registries, for national registries. So I'm just going to ask this outright, and you can tell me to go kick rocks, Wes. But is essentially the Hedera blockchain, is your ambition to create like the lingua franca that underpins the markets? Is this kind of your ambition? And if not, like what is your ambition here for Hedera?
Yeah, so when we started, our goal was just we listened for 2 years. We didn't spend a dollar. We listened. We participated in standards, and we tried to learn. And we saw what other blockchains and protocols focused on, which was a lot on numbers and financialization. But we found that value was only derived when you could link the units, whether it's a carbon credit, a water rate, biodiversity credit, even an emission from an emissions accounting perspective. It was only tied to the methodology and the data. Was the only time we were actually solving a problem because of the coordination of the multiple parties involved, whether it's an auditor like KPMG or Deloitte and a big company and a corporate for scope 1, 2, or 3 accounting to a product carbon footprint and how it's allocated. That's a coordination problem. The carbon markets are the same thing, but with different, you know, VVBs or DOEs, and the standard and the project developer, all the stakeholders, not to get into the buy side. We wanted to solve the problem of those rules and those workflows, make it efficient. And what we've ended up doing is spending a lot of time on that. So we put millions of dollars and years behind this effort to build the Hedera Guardian so we could solve that problem. But in the process, we focused on the cascade of problems that we now can solve because of that. So the financial auditability is one that you can't do without digitization of methodologies. But when you talk about registry systems, we've looked at other public goods and we treat the Hedera Guardian as a public good as well. And we said, well, how do we upgrade the open source systems like the UNDP National Carbon Registry, make sure it's interoperable but integrated on day one with the Hedera Guardian? So when you issue a unit tied to the methodology and the data, that can work as well. But the opportunity is now, well, okay, Verra has all these methodologies, right, that are digitized. How do I make it so whether it's S&P or the National Carbon Registry started by UNDP, that you can issue a unit and trust that it's the unit, and maybe it's the country has to issue the unit. And I don't want to speak for Joe and Verra and the team here, but you can prove that it followed that process, and the workflow just changes slightly. And that slight change still maintains the exact integrity, the exact workflow, and it doesn't move across systems. It is the system. And we do the same thing when it gets to markets for trading, exchanges, and that we see that in water rights. We have water rights, assets that are working in with governments today. We've helped write biodiversity standards so that they can help be enabled in the same way with the Biodiversity Credit Alliance and working with other parties as well. And what we want to try to do is support the environmental integrity so that when we have financial systems, they're sound and built on top of it. And that could be a bond, an SPV, registry tied to a custodian, or in an exchange system with the same. And at the end of the day, I, it's not just a lingua franca, but it's a system that everyone can build on, work with the public goods, and understand that what they're touching and operating with is real from the specific source.
So it's kind of more like a TCP IP kind of layer, right? Like within internet, like it's a network effect, and now you effectively build a common language, and now applications can be effectively built on top of it. Is that a fair assessment?
Absolutely. We modeled our network after Visa, right? And so that's if you read the book of One for Many, that's how the companies that help operate the Hedera network, and you think of Google, Tata, IBM, Nomura, Standard Bank, all these companies are actually running the computers of the network. Most of them are not focused on what you traditionally associate with public blockchains, right? They're focused on how they can get ahead. And this is one of the use cases that they really have been, we've been fortunate and blessed that they cared about and helped us advance. And so when we think about how we build, it has to be in a way that scales for not just enterprises, not just folks who do traditional blockchain activities, but it focuses on solving problems for markets. And those markets need a lot more than just a token, a lot more than just notarization or running a process. It is that communications protocol tied to all of these things. So I think that's a great way to put it.
Cool.
Yeah, I think from a Verra perspective, right, we're gonna continue to remain curious. I think constant curiosity is important, and listen, as Wes alluded to what the market needs are. In the in the short to medium term, we're going to get really good at digitizing these methodologies, leveraging the partnership with Hedera, and focusing on DMRV, because I think those two things together will really help to revolutionize the market quickly or more quickly. And at the same time, then we can kind of learn, have conversations with folks like yourself in terms of what are some of those future use cases that we want to explore down the road.
Oh yeah, and I mean, my brain's just ticking in terms of I see some of these use cases. I mean, the world is shifting so quickly around. Everyone talks about AI as this monolithic thing, but you've got agentic AI, you've got LLMs, you've got all this different transformation, and essentially it's a toolbox, and it's how useful and how good you are at using the tools. It provides you leverage, right? Like if I've got to unscrew the table, but I don't have a screwdriver, I'm kind of fucked, right? So if you have the right tool, you can actually do the right thing, and this to me provides this necessary leverage. So thanks you guys for the really, really interesting conversation. I want to invite you guys back as there's more and more progress. I can just see kind of what's in the sort of in front of you guys around how you're going to create not only that greater throughput, greater confidence and interoperability, but like ultimately how there's greater leverage provided by all of these kind of technological ways that are happening. If I can just summarize, and then I want to give you guys the final words, but like as I'm seeing it, as we wrap, effectively, we started with a story about a registry upgrade, but we really got into essentially where the carbon markets are heading, and you guys are really at the forefront. And effectively, what we're watching is a shift from static PDFs to programmable logic, effectively, right? We're moving away from paper trails to digital trails, essentially, or digital rails, I should say. And that's the kind of the heart of this shift. It's quite powerful. And so really, really glad to have you guys both on. Thanks for the time. Last words, who wants to go first?
No, thanks, Rene, for inviting us. It's been a great conversation. I'd say, for those interested in learning more, please reach out. Like I said, it's projecthub.verra.org. We've got some YouTube videos out there to show you how the functionality works. But I think the cool thing about the market, right, is international audience. And on almost any given day of the week, we're having conversations with all kinds of players, and very, very much an open door, and would love to hear from the folks that are out there. So thanks again, Rene.
Pleasure. Wes, you get the final word.
Awesome. Well, thank you again. This is an awesome conversation. And for folks, again, who want to learn more, engage, build with us. What we do at a foundation is we enable these public goods. If you have a technical audience, come build with us. We have hackathons all the time. We have about $1.5 million of hackathons going on right now. Bounties for digitizing methodologies. Even if you're not part of the Verra team, you can still participate if you say, hey, I want to go do this as part of a process or propose a methodology. Those are things that we enable on a daily, weekly basis. And if you're, you say, hey, I want to learn, we have the webinars all the time from just our open source ecosystem. And there's plenty of applications, whether it's, if I want to start a carbon project, we have applications for that. If I want to think about the next wave of digital, we have folks who can help partner on this to help build your ecosystem. And so we're only going to do all of this together. And that entire workflow is, really just a community getting together to change how the world works. And we're excited to be part of that. And we're excited to be part of this discourse for it as well. So thank you.
Yeah, no, I'm really excited about it because it kind of just opens up these parallels, like a very, let's say, not nascent, but let's say juvenile industry, like what's happening in the crypto markets, right? They've exploded in terms of size because of these type of strong foundational layers. And I think what we're ushering in here is the growth of carbon markets and carbon as an asset class built on really strong foundations. So I really enjoyed the conversation, guys. Again, thank you, and come back and join us another time. And thanks for encouraging folks to engage with you. We'll put some stuff in the show notes, and when we publish this on LinkedIn, please engage. I really want to have these types of conversations in future episodes. Thanks very much.
Awesome.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks, Rene.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it. I'll stop recording, but that was killer. We're not going to have to stop anything.